Good morning, everybody. It's about 5. You see what time it is here. 5:17 a.m. I'm on my way to southeastern Pennsylvania for work. But in any event, I've discussed many times over the years this interesting question about the social construct of tznius, of the laws of modesty. How exactly do they work? Is there an idea in Jewish law that modesty depends on the community in which one resides? Now, while this Gemara is stating a halachic issue really in Hilchos Shabbos, it addresses an issue in Hilchos tznius, meaning we're talking about the laws of the Sabbath, but it also addresses an issue in the laws of modesty. But I think it also addresses a hashkafic issue, a philosophical issue, as far as issues of tznius, of modesty, in light of this statement here in the Rashi. So we're in the Gemara in Shabbos Pei Amud Aleph, Tractate Sabbath 80, side A. Page 80, side A, and it's discussing the question. Mishnah here is discussing when you carry things on the Sabbath, it has to be a useful amount of things for it to be considered a sin of carrying. On the Sabbath, we're not allowed to carry from a private domain to public domain to private domain, and within a public domain, we cannot carry an item for 4 cubits. Cubit is the length from the elbow to the tip of the extended longest finger. There are different opinions about how much that is. So about 18 inches. So it's about 1.5 feet. Some say it's more, 20 inches, 22 inches, different opinions. So the question was how much eye makeup is considered useful, and then the question is enough to color one eye or 2 eyes. And there was a disagreement whether it's 1 eye or 2 eyes. For that, how many eyes does a woman tend to apply makeup to color? So it says that the women, they were very modest in those days, perhaps even more modest than the women in certain Islamic cultures who wear a total veil, but their eyes are exposed. In the Jewish culture in those days, much different today, obviously, even in the vast majority of the ultra-Orthodox communities, and any communities that practice things similar to this are often labeled as cults, but perhaps unfairly if we look at how things were at that time in history, that the women would cover their faces and one of their eyes. They only needed 1 eye to see. But then, very interestingly, this was all in the interest of modesty, yet nonetheless, that eye that was exposed to be able to see was still adorned with makeup. So it shows that there's a balance between beauty and modesty. That was part of the culture of that time. And it says there was another opinion that no, 1 eye is not significant, but 2 eyes enough. Which again, these are all both very small amounts of makeup, but that the general discussion here is how much is useful. So it's enough to color one eye or twice that much, enough to color two eyes. So what about this opinion of two eyes? So the Rebbe Shmuel Bar it says Targum Hillel break the Shmuel Bar Nachmani, that when that Hillel, not the famous Hillel, but this Hillel, who's the son of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, explained.
In a quarter mile, continue onto Brook Road.
Who wears makeup on two of their eyes? Kitanya hi bironios. Even though usually the word ear means a city, especially in the context of Talmud Shabbos, which this is not the context here, ear often just means a contiguous community, which could be actually rather small and be called an ear. And linguistically speaking, it seems to go back and forth. The word ear, the word krach, ben krach l'ir, ben ir l'krach.
Continue for 7 miles.
So in this particular context, so it means the women who live in a community that's called an ear with ayin, which again usually means city, but here it doesn't mean a city. Rashi explains benos kfarim, means women.
Welcome to Pennsylvania.
From small villages. Why? Einan tzrichas tznius kol kach. So the women who live in the small villages don't need as much modesty as the women who live in the big cities. Why? She'ein schoik v'kalas roish motzei sham. Because there's not as much levity and potential for immorality in a small village as there is in a big city. Because there are very few people there and everybody knows everybody, right? So if you do something inappropriate, everybody's going to know about it. And so that's enough of a deterrent against immorality. And since that's the case, very interesting. So the women in the big cities who want to maintain their dignity and their modesty have to go, because the community around them is so corrupt, they have to take the extra step. There was a drasha that I heard years ago that I've often repeated. People ask why today we see there's a rise in ultra-orthodoxy, that things that used to be considered just for Hasidim v'anshe Maisa, that were just for extra pious people, have become more and more mainstream within Orthodoxy, meaning even within communities that we would call today modern Orthodox are much more religious than they were, let's say, in the 1950s, 1960s. Religious in the sense of the etymology of the term religion, meaning that which one is bound into, that the both men and women, meaning in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, you'd have the Rebbitzins, Rosh Yeshivas, who didn't cover their hair, Rebbitzins of the Rosh Yeshiva, who didn't cover their hair. I even remember what my Rosh Yeshiva said, in those days a Rosh Yeshiva's wife could wear, I don't want to repeat, a miniskirt. I think that's an exaggeration, but not, that's what they would call then in the 60s, whatever, but it was something that would not be considered tznius today. That was what was considered, that was the way people lived back then. And hair covering was very uncommon in those days. And so, and I'm not saying this to criticize, I'm saying this is a historical fact. We could just let the testimony of history work for itself. But the point that I'm bringing out here is, we have in Parshas Naso, which is a long way off, a few months off, right? But we can still look at it, even during Parshas Noach, especially because Parshas Noach it talks about Behishchitz called Basar Starkei, that there was a hashchasa. So that there was a perversion in the world. It's mentioned in the end of Bereshis, and it leads up into Noach. It's repeated in Noach in these chapters in Genesis that we're reading liturgically these weeks. But the point that I'm bringing out here is Parshas Naso, the very famous question that Rashi brings down there in the Chumash. Lama nismecha Parshas Nazir leParshas Sota. Maybe I got it backwards, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure of myself. But why is the laws of the Nazirite right after the laws of the Sota, of the woman who is suspected of adultery? Says the Gemara, the Talmud tells us, Mi Shirah as a Sota Bekilkula Yazer's Atzvay Min Hayayin. Someone who sees the woman suspected of adultery in her state of disgrace will understand that indulging in alcohol, things like that, which is not a sin, you're allowed to drink alcohol. Sometimes it's a mitzvah to drink wine. Even other forms of alcohol could be somewhat of a type of a religious devotion. Nonetheless, it's a time and a place for everything. And someone who sees the immorality of the world, and that the world is in a very immoral state, will separate himself from wine, will take on vows, the Nazirite vows. Meaning to say, when the world or the community is not in such a state, then such extra stringencies are unnecessary, and possibly even wrong, because of their lack of necessity. And so we see in this case, I often tell over a drasha that I remember hearing in the modern Orthodox shul, more than 23, 24, maybe 25 years ago. 24 years ago probably. It was a guest speaker in a modern Orthodox shul in Queens, and he said the following. This is something we've brought up many times on our podcast and so forth. That Oliver Hardy, why did he play with his tie? Why was that his trademark of his little twitch? It was a silent movie he was making, I guess, for Max Sennett or not Max Sennett, for maybe in those days it probably was Max Sennett. And trying to think of the other fellow's name. He's buried in Elmira, New York, in the same cemetery with Mark Twain. He lived a long life. I can't. He made the Little Rascals and whatever it was. he was making a silent film, and he was playing a sailor swabbing the deck, and he got water thrown on him, right, like a wave. And he thought maybe it'd be funny if he blows his nose in his tie. And he realized that film was very expensive in those days. If he blows his nose in the tie, the censors are going to say,
in a quarter mile, turn left to stay on Pennsylvania 434 South.
that is vulgar, and they'll cut it out of the movie. And then the director or the producer, or likely the producer, Hal Roach is what I was thinking of. I think again at that point it was back then. It was before. I think it was before.
Take the next left to stay on Pennsylvania 434 South.
So if the producer is going to charge Oliver Hardy for that Hefsed Maruba, for that big loss that he had.
Continue on Pennsylvania 434 South for 6 miles.
In the necktie. And so instead of, he hopped just before, he fiddled with the tie, and that became his trademark for the next, 20 years, 30 years. So today, you can imagine blowing your nose in a tie, that's considered vulgar. And the one that this rabbi didn't mention in his drasha, but that I knew of from reading Charlie Chaplin's autobiography, was that when Chaplin made The Great Dictator, he was very afraid that the censors were going to cut up the whole movie. And he said there was only one thing the censors removed, a dirty word that he used, a vulgar word, Lousy, lousy. It's a reference to lice. People don't know what does lousy mean. It means it's filled with lice. People think lousy just means subpar. And so since there's something vulgar about that word lousy, which again, reference to lice, how's that vulgar? Because that was the social mores of the censors and so forth in 1940. Not that everybody was so puritanical, but that there was enough of a pushback and there was commercial interest and so forth for a certain level of puritanicalism, the Hays Code and so forth. And then the next example, go another decade and a half later, and you had I Love Lucy. And they were not allowed to say the word pregnant. I think maybe they were allowed to say expecting. Because that's a dirty word. We talked about that on the podcast recently. And then the same issue was with, all of those TV shows, husbands and wives slept in separate beds, like the frum people do. And even you go to the 1970s, late 60s and early 70s, the Brady Bunch, where they showed the bathroom. I think the earlier shows they didn't even show a bathroom, but there was no toilet in the bathroom. It's just a sink where you could brush your teeth. So and now you have shows that are just so totally disgusting. It's not what to talk about. So because of the depravity of the society today, so that's what you have there. You go from Misha Roas and Soita Ben Kulkula, you see the depraved state. You're going to have to be more modest, but it shows here that it could depend on from one community to another. Because we see in the small towns, there was not as much worry of immodesty and of immorality. So the women could relax themselves a little bit, and they didn't have to cover their face. They probably still wore something more like a hijab that covered probably, the neckline and everything, the neck and the whole head and everything. It's probably what they wore at that time. I'm not saying that that's what we should wear now. I'm saying that historically, that's how people dressed in those times. Men also dressed differently than we dress now. Although my understanding is that within the house, it might not have been like that. Again, there's a difference of how someone went in public and went in private. To the point where there's questions of people who didn't have much money, and did they even wear anything when they're cooking and preparing food and so forth, just out of interest of preserving their clothing and so forth. So they wore very little clothing, perhaps in the house, although there's indications elsewhere in Chazal that there were very modest women who even within their house they covered up, and even they covered their hair. They said the walls of their house never saw their hair. Again, these were things we're talking about. Midas Chasidus, talking about extra levels of piety. So, but the point is that it is certainly a social construct. So, meaning, there's certain Orthodox communities where everyone's Shamrei Shabbos and they keep Taras Mishpacha, they keep Kashrus, they keep everything. But maybe the women don't cover their hair. Maybe they only cover their hair when they go to shul. Different things like that. And there's a famous tshuva of Rav Mashash from Morocco, who he said it's essentially a social construct. I guess at that time the French influence was taking over Morocco. You can imagine, we think of Morocco as a very Muslim country, so therefore, if the women are, both the Jewish and non-Jewish women are going to cover up. But that's not exactly how it was in the early 20th century. The influence from France, things went back and forth in a lot of these countries. The same thing. Iran under the Shah is different than under the Ayatollah. It seems like the Hamanam, the majority of the people in Iran, probably want to go back to the Shah or some other form and not have the Ayatollahs. So, but in any event, the point that I'm trying to bring out here is that a lot of these things are social constructs, but when we're faced with being in a place that's less than ideal, we have to go perhaps to the opposite extreme, whether it's a time in history or a place geographically. It also shows that living in cities big cities is not a good way. It's not a good way to live. And they certainly encourage more and more people to consider a rural lifestyle. I'll be honest. When I go into big cities, I get a little nervous.
In a quarter mile, continue straight onto Blooming Grove Road.
Things are the way they are. But that's the point, though, that I want to
continue straight onto Blooming Grove Road.
And it's interesting. Like I saw, very prominent Orthodox Jewish woman who lives in a community that's not, a Haredi community, a modern Orthodox community. Her husband doesn't even wear a yarmulke every day.
Continue on Pennsylvania 739 South for half a mile.
So, but when she goes, let's say, to daven by Kivrei Tzadikim, something like that, she covers her hair and she wears a more modest attire. So that's kind of the point that we wanted to bring out here. So essentially that's so on one hand you respect the community where you live.
In a quarter mile, turn right onto the I-84 West ramp to Scranton.
Standards. But also, it seems that when you're in that added that much time. So, you have these things in mind. So thank you for watching. God bless.
Turn right onto the I-84 West ramp.
Subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later. How do I turn this thing off? I talked long enough. How did that end?
In a quarter mile, merge onto I-84.
Trying to get to shul. And why isn't it turning off?